There was a potential for a domino effect to start in the Middle East right after the end of the Second World War. There the Soviet Union established two puppet governments in northwestern Iran and refused to leave. Had this escalated and Iran became communist, the whole Cold War could thus change. The Soviets would now have a warm water port and an Iranian puppet state, but also the door to British India and the Middle East would be open, leading to the spread of communism in the region. This book by Alexander Stoyanov is about the Russo-Turkish Wars, and although the last one was technically in 1914 during the Great War, it also partially mentions the Cold War, where it says something really interesting, also further mentioned in this book by Douglas Boyd. This is that the Middle East in the early Cold War was mostly heavily anti-Western and anti-imperialist. Russia and their successor the Soviet Union had no history of expansionism in the region, which made those countries want to work with the Soviets over the West. Some nations like Iraq went as far to fully ally with them from 1959 to 1968. Egypt under Gamal Abdel Nasser, Baptist Syria, North Yemen, Algeria and Libya post-1969 all preferred to work with the Soviet Union, although not becoming fully communist and joining the Warsaw Pact. So here is the premise of today's video: what if the Soviet Union managed to get Iran on their side, opening up the way for a lot more Soviet influence in the Middle East, and sparking up new conflicts and proxy wars. Much like Southeast Asia, the West would fear that if one country falls to communism, then the rest would follow, which, considering what I said earlier, would be a fair assumption. So the West would have to intervene as to stop the Soviets. Let me show you what I came up with. So how does the Soviet Union gain Iran on their side? I think we should go back to the Second World War, where Operation Barbarossa was just initiated. There Stalin suffered greatly, and the West sent Lend-Lease to the Soviets, about 35% of which arrived there through Iran. As to secure a safe passage, the Iranians were occupied by the Allies. The north was by the Soviet Union and the south was by the British. Allied occupation of Iran was agreed to end 6 months after the end of the Second World War, so by March 1946. Stalin, however, had different ideas. The Azerbaijani People's Government was formed in November 1945, while a smaller Republic of Mahabad was declared in January 1946. The Soviet Union was supposed to leave Iran, but when the British left, they secured favorable deals for the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company that benefited the British greatly, which made the Soviet Union want to do the same before they leave as well. As a result of that, the United Nations intervened and forced the Soviets and Iran to resolve their issue as soon as possible. Stalin managed to secure 51% of the Iranian oil, but when he withdrew from the country, this agreement was almost immediately revoked, lasting for about a year. There is a theory that Stalin decided to leave Iran to fall to the West, where the Soviets would instead focus on helping China in their civil war, and I think that this makes sense. Mao Zedong's communist China was the underdog there, so getting China communist was a priority for Stalin. The thing is that in my opinion, I don't think it worked out too well for them long term. The Sino-Soviet split happened in 1961, so China was no longer officially allied to Moscow, while for the Soviets, securing Iran would have been a better long-term strategy, allowing them to expand their influence into the Middle East. Instead, all of this made Iran an American ally until the Iranian Revolution. So now you know about the Iranian occupation, the fact that Stalin established two puppet governments and why he left the country peacefully. But what if he didn't, and instead tried to get Iran to go fully communist and ally with them? How can we make Iran go communist in the late 1940s? Well, it would be unrealistic no matter what. As I said, the Soviets getting Iran and influence in the Middle East instead of helping out China would be better for their long-term strategy, but for this to happen it would require Stalin to think decades in advance, way past his death. Yet I came up with something more plausible to have this all unfold. I think we should start with the Tudeh party, which was ready to carry out the orders of the Kremlin even if it meant sacrificing Iranian sovereignty. This is perfect for the goal of this alternate history, so how can we make this party more popular? Well, with the Anglo-Soviet invasion of Iran in 1941, we could secure more favorable borders for the Soviets. Let me explain. Historically, both Britain and the USSR had supported loyalists in their occupied territories. If the Soviet occupation zone is larger, this could translate to more support to the Tudeh party 5 years down the line. This I think is possible as Britain invaded Iran only to protect their oil and prevent it from going to Germany instead, but also to prevent Iran from allying with Germany. Thus, Britain cared mostly about the oil, which is mostly around the Persian Gulf, while the Soviet Union would instead occupy large population centers, with the pretext of preventing the rise of ultranationalism. At these dire times, I think that Britain would agree to this. After all, the British army at this point would not be able to effectively resist an ultranationalist Iranian revolution, but their army was compact enough for them to protect the oil wells. The deal of the Anglo-Soviet invasion of Iran would be simple. Britain would take the oil and station a bit of troops there, while the Soviets would take the cities and establish order, preventing the rise of ultranationalism. If this were to happen, then most of Iran would have already been in the Soviet sphere by the time of 1946, and this would include the capital of Tehran. Now, is this realistic? Well, I don't think so, but it is the least unrealistic way we can have Iran to go communist compared to some other alternatives, so I would roll with it. What happens now is that the Tudeh party's popularity is enough for them to become a major political force. Further, the two puppet republics in northwestern Iran were actually popular among the local people, which would be used by the Tudeh party as an example of prosperity of what can happen under Soviet rule. When the deadline for Britain and the Soviets to leave Iran would approach, this time the dynamics would be really different. Britain would still try to secure favorable deals for the Anglo-Iranian oil company, but the Tudeh party, including their coalition partners, who would have more influence over the Shah, would refuse to cave into these imperialist demands. At this point, the Soviet Union would step in, and we would have a major change from our history. Stalin wouldn't demand the 51% of oil production. He only did this historically as he knew that Iran wouldn't be in his sphere, but now the tables have flipped. Now Iran is looking to join the Soviet bloc, so there is no need for Stalin to directly take any oil, as Iran would become a puppet state of them either way. At this point, the popularity of the Tudeh party I think would surge, as the local Iranians would have two options. Either they accept the British deal and give out of their oil to imperialist Britain, while the Shah would return to power, who was also very unpopular, or the second option is that they side with the Soviets, not give up any oil and actually kicking out the British fully. Now I want to reiterate that the Soviet Union would have more sinister motives, and Iran eventually becomes a puppet state, but this wouldn't be so apparent right away. From the Iranian point of view, the Soviet Union would be the liberators, as they had liberated Eastern Europe. In early 1946, the Soviet Union wasn't an expansionist power. In Eastern Europe, until this point they had promised free and fair elections, which could be also extended to Iran as well. All of this would happen before the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, where the true nature of the Soviet Union started to show to the rest of the world. Here is what happens next. The Iranians support the Tudeh party and British influence is kicked out of their country, with Iran becoming communist. As I mentioned earlier, the Tudeh party was willing to compromise their national sovereignty as to appease the Soviet Union, so this all but guarantees that they would become a Soviet puppet state like the countries in Eastern Europe. Further, historically, the USSR moved 30,000 troops into the Azerbaijani People's Government, their puppet state in Iran. I think that Stalin could have intended for it to join the Azerbaijani SSR, so I would have this happen here, with the pretext of reducing ethnic violence in Iran. Although the future of Iran would be fairly chosen by the Iranian people, the West is not going to respond so kindly, and I can see them to escalate the situation. The British would lose massive oil interests, sparking up economic and political panic in London. British India and Iraq are now threatened by the communists, so this would become a big deal. Now I want to tell you a bit what happened historically when the Soviet Union established these two puppet states. The United States of America had protested this move to the United Nations, and Harry Truman initiated a policy of containment, practically ending the American isolationism period and starting to support nations under the threat of communism. Even in our history, the crisis was a big deal, being the first one of the Cold War. There, the United States moved aircraft carriers into the Mediterranean Sea, and this Iranian crisis could have sparked a possible conflict with the Soviet Union. Now, in this alternate history, the Soviets have secured Iran, so we can assume that Britain, the United States, and the United Nations would be very much furious. The thing is that I don't believe that a full-blown war would start over this. Let me explain. About a month ago I made this video about Operation Unthinkable happened, where 4 out of 5 content creators said that the Soviet Union would be victorious. And I also want to bring it up here. The West starting a war could be a death sentence for them. France was about 45% socialist if they were to make a popular front. Italy was about 35% socialist. Britain had just replaced Churchill with Attlee, and the Labour Party wanted peace, while the United States wanted for their soldiers to return from abroad wars. Further, in this book about the Churchill Testament by Lord Alan Watson, it mentions how in the United States, Joseph Stalin was referred to as Uncle Joe, and the American public had somewhat favorable view of him during the Second World War before the Cold War. This book mentions how the American propaganda said that the Soviet Union is a friend and that Germany and Japan are enemies. If this alternate Third World War were to break out, it would be America fighting on the side of their former enemies of Germany and maybe Japan, against their former ally of the Soviet Union. And this book mentions just how big of a shift it would be to the public. As such, this war would be deeply unpopular to happen in 1946. Again, as to mention Britain, they were just starting to decolonize and lose India and Pakistan the next year, while also starting to leave Africa, so a war with Stalin likely means a delay to decolonization, which would only further fuel the rebels and communist support in the African colonies. In fact, Stalin would claim that he is liberating and decolonizing Iran from British influence, which could secure him support from the local Iranians. All of this is to say that I'm certain that the Soviet Union would get away with puppeting Iran, but there would surely be a diplomatic crisis and the Iranian government in exile, most likely based in Britain. So the USSR got away with it. What is next? Well, this is the first domino that would fall, which could lead to many more in the coming decades. On the 1st of May 1951, the Universal Workers' Day, the Iranian oil would be officially nationalized, much like historically, but this time with more Soviet support. Historically, when the Iranians did this, oil production had tanked. Iran relied on the British to dig for their oil, which came with British equipment and engineers. When the oil was nationalized, these were kicked out, so Iranian oil production had been destroyed, with some places stopping to operate entirely. In the following years, oil production had crashed about 90%, with the British being forced to leave, and the Iranians not being able to operate the oil wells to the same efficiency. This time, I don't think this would be the case, as the Soviet Union would be digging oil nearby in Baku, so they would help Iran in extracting their oil. Further, as Iran historically didn't have enough tankers to export this oil, the Soviet Union could help them in this department as well. It all seems that the Iranian-Soviet collaboration would be actually beneficial for both sides, hence why communism in Iran may become even more popular thereafter. Of course, Stalin would exploit the local people, this is guaranteed to happen, but it would be different than under the British, so I can see the quality of life in Iran to actually improve. Going around the world, the Korean War would still kick off, and China would have been mostly unified, without Soviet support, so we would have the same world as our history, just Iran is now communist due to a few key changes we have made, so nothing major is butterflied away until now. The 1953 Iranian coup d'etat, also known as Operation Ajax, happened in our history with the goal of replacing the Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, who was in favor of nationalization, with the Shah, who was more Western-leaning. This operation was historically carried out by the CIA and MI6, and they actually succeeded in this, so the Iranian oil was once again in the hands of the West, where the British, French, Americans and Dutch were allowed to operate there. All of this happened because Iran nationalized their oil, which would be the case in this alternate history as well, under communist Iran, so I can see a similar operation to get carried out as well, with the West trying to put the Shah back in power and free the Iranians from the Soviet rule. So does this happen in this alternate history? Well, I think so. Now I know what you're thinking, but rewriting history, the CIA intervening in other nations' politics as to prevent them from becoming communist is crazy and unrealistic. Said no one ever. I think we should look at Operation Valuable in 1949 to 1954, where the United Kingdom and the United States, in collaboration with other Western Bloc nations, attempted to remove the Albanian ruler Enver Hoxha from power. At this point, the Warsaw Pact wasn't formed officially, but Albania was still kind of a Soviet satellite, so I think that this proves that the West would be willing to attempt to cool Soviet satellite states, which is the case for Iran here. Now I want to be very clear, if the Americans manage to overthrow the Soviet-led government in Iran and replace it with the Shah's monarchy, then we would basically return to our history, but the Soviet Union has annexed Azerbaijani territories in northwestern Iran, so nothing would change in the Cold War. Iran would still have an Islamic revolution around the same time, and the Soviet Union would still collapse, but Azerbaijan is potentially larger in the modern day, so not a great difference. As to keep the video more interesting and have the domino effect in the Middle East to continue, we need for Operation Ajax to fail, much like to how Operation Valuable did in Albania, which I don't think is crazy unrealistic. Remember, the Soviets sent 30,000 soldiers just to the Azerbaijani People's Government, and now with the whole of Iran, there is likely hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers there, in addition to Soviet workers supporting the Iranian oil production and operating the warm water ports. So this alternate 1953 Iranian coup d'etat would fail, so what would happen next? Well, in our history, Iraq and Transjordan temporarily united to form the Hashemite Arab Federation, but only 6 months later, in the 1958 Iraqi Revolution, they made Iraq a republic. By March 1959, the new Iraqi government had withdrawn from the Baghdad Pact and aligned itself with the Soviet Union. Now, with Iran becoming communist in the late 1940s, we could see Iraq to join the Soviet sphere a lot sooner than 1958. Historically, Iraq saw widespread disapproval of Western influence, which was closely resembled in other Arab states, as I mentioned in the book by Alexander Stoyanov. The Russians had no history of colonization and exploitation of Arabia, which only made them a natural ally of the Arabs. This makes me think that Operation Ajax would have been instead initiated on Iraq, but there is a problem. The Iraqi revolutionaries in 1958 historically killed the King Faisal II, Prince Abd al-Ilah and Prime Minister Nuri al-Said. So who would the Americans and British support as to oppose Iraq becoming communist? Well, for the case of Iran historically, this was easy, it was the Shah, but here in Iraq, all prominent political figures were now assassinated. As such, I think that the CIA would arm local rebels and separatists, potentially the Kurdish people up north, as to stabilize Iraq and depose the communist government. The Soviet Union would still have control over the Kurdish Republic of Mahabad, so as a sign of goodwill, I think that the Soviets would give it to Iraq, which would appease the Kurds there. Further, the Soviet Union would support Kurdish rebels in Turkey, promising them liberation from Western oppression. I think that this move would only cool down the Kurdish rebels in Iraq, who would now side with the Soviets, and instead they would harass Turkey. This means that the Americans cannot really rally behind somebody powerful enough to succeed the Iraqi government after the coup is successful, which is the same reason as to why Operation Valuable historically failed, so I believe that this coup would also fail, but is sure to cause plenty of damage in Iraq. At this point the year would be around 1955, so the Warsaw Pact would still get formed, including Iran and Iraq in this alternate history. India and Pakistan would have become officially independent, no longer just British dominions, and have finished their 1947-1948 war over Jammu and Kashmir. India was historically flirting with socialism, and now Soviet Iran gives the communist world a way to spread their ideology beyond Eurasia. Still, I don't expect India to become fully communist just because of that, but their popularity would still grow. India is as of now still part of the non-aligned movement. The year of 1956 would be a big one, especially in the month of October, where France, Britain and Israel would invade Egypt after President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. Historically, this was a disaster, and Nasser emerged as a hero of Arab nationalism, later making an Arab federation, uniting with Syria temporarily. The Western invasion of Syria was condemned by both the Soviet Union and the United States of America, but now it could play out a little more differently. America is starting to get scared of the domino effect that is unfolding in the Middle East, and they already lost Iraq and Iran, so they would have to put their foot down. The thing is that America didn't know about this Franco-British operation until it was initiated, which made President Eisenhower really mad, hence why he didn't support it. Now, does America get involved considering the different circumstances? Well, they're for sure not going to oppose it, but this doesn't really change much. The position of America at the time is very much important to be understood. President Eisenhower wanted to present himself to the Third World as anti-imperialist, so this would become a tough call for him to make. Does he let Egypt and other Arab countries fall to communism, or does he intervene? But the Third World would see that the West is imperialist, while the Soviets would become seen as liberators. What I can see America is to do is to work with France and Britain, even Israel, to make a different operation to regain the Suez Canal. Historically, Israel was prompted to invade Egypt, then France and Britain intervened as to secure the Suez Canal and act as peacekeepers. But the world knew that they were just trying to retake it, and were the ones who initiated Israel to attack. As Eisenhower still wants to present himself as anti-imperialist, he cannot just help France and Britain to take back the Suez Canal. This would be a political suicide. Instead, what he can try to do is to remove the Egyptian president Gamal Abdel Nasser from power. The idea would be to establish a friendly Egypt that still has the Suez Canal under their control, but is allied with the West, giving no need for France and Britain to directly own the Suez Canal. This may seem like a minor deal, but actually instead of new colonialism, this operation is one of containment, which was the main strategy of the Americans, hence why I think it's realistic. So, in this alternate history, the goal is not to take the Suez Canal, but to assassinate President Nasser and replace him with somebody else, and this time the Americans would also get involved, not just France, Britain and Israel. The thing is that this operation may still fail. Historically, President Nasser was shot by the Muslim Brotherhood in 1954 during a speech, where he continued after being shot as if nothing had happened, which only bolstered his popularity greatly. I think it's fair to say that he was the leader of Egypt. Today he is remembered as a national hero that stood up to the West, improved Egypt's infrastructure and economic situation for the poor, and being the face of Arab unity. This guy is a big deal, and his popularity was only tarnished by him losing the Six-Day War in 1967, which is 11 years after the Suez crisis, so his popularity in Egypt at that time would be at an all-time high. Further, in 1956, when the Americans would attempt to assassinate him, his popularity was among the highest. He was deeply backed by the military and loved by the public for nationalizing the Suez Canal. Just 10 months before the Suez crisis, Sudan had gained their independence, so due to timing, the Americans cannot arm Sudanese rebels as to destabilize Egypt. I mentioned how popular Nasser was, and this is why I think that this operation to remove him from power could actually fail. With Nasser having the support of the people and the military, there is not a lot of opposition groups for the Americans to arm and make them cause trouble. I'd say that Nasser was mostly like Castro, where the CIA tried to assassinate him multiple times, but failed every time. Now I want to be clear, it's not impossible that America manages to assassinate Nasser, but he was such a big leader at the time it would make predicting everything what happens in the Middle East really difficult. At this point, any sane alternate history YouTuber would stop, as we're 10 years into the future and are about to eliminate the most prominent Arab politician at the time. So know that the video past this point is only for entertainment, as there would be little realism. If you seek a realistic answer, the domino effect in the Middle East would stop here, but in 1955, the Southeast Asia would start with the Vietnam War. Egypt would become Western in this alternate history, but the government would be very unpopular, and the Arab states would be more divided than ever. Since Egypt would be Western here, and Israel would be a key American ally in the Middle East, the Six-Day War may never happen, or it could be altered, but it would still result in a Western victory. Overall, not a lot will change in the realistic scenario, so let me continue despite being more unrealistic, as I think it has the potential to be my most interesting video I have ever made. Now, what I think is more reasonable to happen is that President Nasser survives the first assassination attempt, which makes him more cautious in the future. I don't think that America manages to succeed on the first try, as their pool of Arab recruits to carry out this operation would be very narrow, considering the popularity of Nasser. As Egypt was still authoritarian, this failed assassination attempt on his life would make Nasser restrict some civil liberties and empower the police and military, making it much more difficult for more assassination attempts on his life. Now let me show you how the continent of Africa looked like in 1956, and as you can see, France and Britain are mostly still there, with only a few places gaining their independence. The Soviet Union is now in a really favorable position. They can more successfully portray the Western nations as imperialist, citing their attempts to coup Iraq and their attempts to kill Nasser, but also how France, Britain and others are still present in Africa and throughout the world. This only makes communism more popular worldwide, and with Iran being in the Soviet sphere, there is an easier way for it to spread more than historically. This is because the Soviet Union was mostly limited to Europe by the Mediterranean Sea, where the Greeks and the Turks hold the choke points, restricting the Soviet access to the world's oceans, which is now not the case. Even though this scenario is crazy and unrealistic, I want to continue it, as it's shaping out to be very interesting. The Vietnam War would still start, and Africa is starting to decolonize, so there would be plenty of civil wars and pro-communist governments. Now the Western attention would be split in two, Southeast Asia and the Middle East, where there would be two dominoes in effect, and most likely America has to choose to commit to one. Considering how they performed in the Vietnam War, I don't think that America could actually be everywhere all at once. Even further, the public pressure would only increase domestically after their failed assassination attempt on Nasser, so what is next? Well, I really wanted to keep Nasser alive, as historically the Middle East had a Cold War in itself, called the Arab Cold War. There one side was represented by Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, who supported Arab socialism and anti-colonialism. The other side was represented by Saudi Arabia, who supported traditional monarchy and pro-Western policies. In this alternate history, I can still see Egypt and Syria to unite in 1958, and I want to show you this coin that I have. This coin is from the United Arab Republic, aka Syria and Egypt, from the year of 1967, but by this point Syria had already left the Union. The thing is that in this alternate history the circumstances are very different. Syria would remain under Egypt, and the country would become a lot more socialist leaning than historically, with them joining the Eastern Bloc not being too unreasonable, but could cause several diplomatic crises. What I think could happen is for them to at least receive Soviet support, investments, and for them to join their shared market. The country of Iraq joining this Arab Union is also not too unreasonable, which I would have happened here for the sake of this alternate history. Here the Soviet Union has done what Russia could never do, secure an access to the Mediterranean Sea via Iran, Iraq and Syria, bypassing the choke points in the Dardanelles. This is of course going to be met with panic by the West, but they are busy dealing with the war in Vietnam, so in this alternate history the world has become a lot more violent and we have drastically increased the odds of a third world war. The other block of this Arab Cold War would be the Western monarchies in the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia, Jordan, South Yemen, Oman and likely Israel as well. Kuwait, United Arab Emirates and Bahrain were still under the British, but with the increased pressure of decolonization, they may become independent decades sooner and join this bloc. As you can see, the Middle East has become a lot more tense than usual. The Jebel Akhdar War, which is basically the Omani civil war, would be funded by both sides. The Soviet Union will support the Imamate of Oman, which is the interior, while the British would support the exterior. Historically, the exterior won the Omani civil war and became pro-Western, but now we would have a proxy conflict in the region, which can see thousands more casualties. I would cover who wins there a bit later. The 1958 Lebanon crisis I think would still end in the same way. Historically the country was neutral, but with Syria and Egypt uniting, the Muslims wanted to join this new country, while the Christians opposed it. As 14,000 United States Marines landed in Beirut in July 1958, the conflict was decided and Lebanon remained independent. In this alternate history, again it may escalate further, with the Soviet Union and their allies securing support for Lebanese Muslims, creating another proxy conflict in the Middle East. The North Yemen civil war was brutal in our history, where Egypt historically sent 70,000 troops there, being called Nasser's Vietnam. It was already a proxy war in the heart of Arabia, but now I can expect this to see more American and Soviet support for either side. So the Middle East is just plagued by conflict by the socialists in favor of a union and democracies in favor of keeping the monarchies. As you can see, we have about quadrupled the hotspots in the Middle East, so the chance of a third world war happening has increased drastically, but I will not cover this option as then the scenario becomes impossible to predict. So how would all of these proxy wars go? Well, I think that they are several times more deadly and destructive, but the West has the geographical proximity, so I would assume that they would win all of them. With Lebanon being a Pyrrhonic victory, as the country would become more unstable than before, and the Muslims would feel like second-class citizens, likely being ruled by a small Christian minority. All of this is paving the way for the Lebanese civil war from 1975 to 1990 to happen a lot sooner, and to a greater intensity and loss of life. So the region is more tense, right? Well, I think it would become even worse. The Soviet Union would station nuclear weapons in the Middle East, with the Americans doing the same. Another interesting idea is that OPEC, the international cartel of oil-producing countries, is never formed in the same way, or it would become Soviet-aligned later, as the Soviet Union kind of controls most of the oil production in the region. Now, not only are there many more proxy wars being fought, but also both sides have put nuclear weapons in the Middle East. By the 1960s, China and the Soviet Union would officially split, as China continues supporting communism in Southeast Asia, while the Soviets continue supporting communism in the Middle East. The West is now very overstretched, more so than historically. Cyprus may become quite important for the Soviet Union, where the Soviets could back the Greek Cypriots, especially Makairos, and other left-wing leaders, where the Soviet Union would attempt to subjugate the country and make it like the Mediterranean Cuba. Now I don't think that this would happen, and Greece and Turkey may find a way to peacefully resolve this issue, and just kidding, they will still go to war over Cyprus. The Soviets wouldn't get the island, I think that this is for sure, but they can support rebels as to stabilize the region further, while the western allies of Greece and Turkey would be fighting each other. The Soviets would love to arm both sides and make this continue for as long as possible. The Yom Kippur War is something that I really don't want to cover. If it still happens, then it would be the biggest escalation of the Cold War in this alternate history, as with nukes being present in the region on both sides, I think it could go nuclear. More than likely, these nuclear weapons would serve as a deterrent, so Israel could be permanently isolated, due to them not finding any real allies in the Middle East, and relying on Britain and America for help, which were very far and away for support. Afghanistan may also be altered. Due to the domino effect, they may become a lot more socialist naturally, or perhaps the opposite is true. Saudi Arabia and Jordan would fund the Taliban-like movements, where in our history it was only Pakistan doing this. This could lead to an earlier Afghanistani civil war, but the Soviets getting involved too much I think is unneeded, as they already have Iran. Further, if the United Arab Republic is stable and successful, which I mean they did collapse historically, but also they would now be funded by the Soviet Union, so it's hard to say, then Jordan would be in big trouble. The monarchy was strongly pro-Western ever since the start, but if their neighboring communist countries are more successful than them, then it could cause a civil war in Jordan, initiated by supporters from them joining the Union. Now this scenario is quite focused on the Middle East, but I'm sure that all I said would have some butterfly effects in Asia, perhaps with the Americans being more overstretched and have more public pressure they could leave the Vietnam War sooner than historically, and we could also see some changes in Africa, like more countries than historically going communist, but I cannot predict any of this. Now, under these different circumstances, do you think that the Soviet Union would still collapse? Sure, the Western world's economic system was way better than communism, but the Soviets are in a really strong position. They have a lot of cheap oil and cheap labor to sustain their economy. Their collapse is at least delayed for a few years, and maybe even entirely prevented. Gorbachev may successfully reform the Soviet Union, which could see some countries breaking away from the Soviet sphere, but still the USSR would still survive until today if this is the case. Earlier I mentioned this video regarding cooperation unthinkable, so I would suggest that you watch it next as to level up your history knowledge. Thank you very much for watching and I hope to see you there. Goodbye.